I still remember that first drive through Windsor Crossing, the sunshine filtering through the tall oaks, casting dappled shadows on rows of pristine houses. Nestled on the edge of a small city in the American Midwest, the neighborhood had wide, clean sidewalks, freshly cut lawns, and an air of quiet orderliness. Anyone would have called it idyllic. I'd been searching for a calm, pleasant environment in which to live. My work was demanding. As the director of the National Kidney Foundation, I often traveled to medical conferences, worked with hospital administrators, and lobbied state legislators for better support for kidney disease patients. My job was at the intersection of medical advocacy and public policy, and while it was deeply fulfilling, it was also exhausting. But when a real estate agent recommended Windsor Crossing, I hesitated. This particular neighborhood was known to have a strict homeowners association, HOA, called the Windsor Preservation Council. I'd heard cautionary tales of overzealous HOA boards, but the agent insisted that it was a wonderful, tight-knit community. The price was right, the location was convenient, and the house was charming, a two-story craftsman with a bright blue door. So I closed the deal, hoping I could adapt to whatever rules they had in place. My first day in the neighborhood, as I was hauling moving boxes from a rental truck, I spotted a woman in her mid-50s standing on the sidewalk, hands on her hips. She had short, styled hair in a honey blonde hue, wore a pastel blouse tucked into neatly pressed slacks, and gave off an aura of authority. She watched me unload, her gaze scanning every item I carried inside. When our eyes met, she offered a perfunctory smile. "Hello," I said, setting down a box labeled fragile. She stepped forward, the gravel crunching under her sensible pumps. "Hi there, I'm Pamela Arvindale, but everyone calls me Karen." She fished a pamphlet from her handbag. "I'm the president of our HOA board. Let me be the first to say, welcome to Windsor Crossing." I thanked her, but even as I studied her polite smile, I sensed tension. She extended the pamphlet. "Here's a copy of our community guidelines. You'll find everything you need to know: trash pickup days, lawn care expectations, mailbox rules. We take pride in maintaining a certain standard." I nodded, noticing how her eyes flickered to my front yard, as if calculating whether my hedges were exactly the right height. "Of course," I said. "I'll read through them carefully." She gave me a tight nod. "We have a monthly HOA meeting, mandatory for all homeowners. I look forward to seeing you there." Without waiting for an answer, she pivoted on her heel and strolled away, posture stiff and purposeful. As I watched her leave, I felt a strange pang of caution. Something about her manner, the way she carried herself with unyielding certainty, put me on guard. I told myself that perhaps she was just taking her role seriously. But if I'd known how far she would take it, I might have turned and run from Windsor Crossing right then. Over the next few weeks, I settled into my new home. I painted the living room walls a soft sage color, arranged my office with a large desk and shelves for the many medical journals and policy reports I read daily, and even placed a small herb garden on the back patio. Windsor Crossing itself was lovely. People tended to their lawns meticulously. Cars obeyed a slow speed limit, giving children and pets a safe environment. Most neighbors seemed friendly, even if somewhat reserved. Many wore polite smiles, though behind those smiles, I sometimes sensed an undercurrent of unease. One afternoon, as I was trimming my hedges, an elderly woman with a floral sun hat wandered by. She introduced herself as Mrs. Corinne Hughes, a widow who lived 3 houses down. She carried a canvas bag with groceries. Pausing for breath, she asked if I was new to the area. "Yes, just moved in a couple of weeks ago," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves. She smiled warmly. "I hope Windsor Crossing treats you well. It's a quiet place, for the most part. But keep your eyes open." She leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Karen runs a tight ship, you know. She can be difficult." I raised an eyebrow. "I've heard. Has she caused trouble for you?" Mrs. Hughes looked left and right, then nodded. "Oh, I've had my share of warnings. My grass grows faster than I can manage sometimes, with these old bones. She threatened me with fines unless I hired a lawn service. And I've seen her clash with others over things as small as the color of a bird feeder." I chuckled ruefully. "That's quite strict." Mrs. Hughes sighed. "Indeed. But people mostly comply, to avoid confrontation. Speaking of which, are you heading to the HOA meeting next Wednesday? She'll expect you there." I nodded. "I'll be there." Something in Mrs. Hughes's face seemed relieved. It's good to have new blood in the neighborhood. Maybe you can help us keep her in check." With that cryptic remark, she continued on her way, leaving me pondering how an HOA president could inspire so much unease. A few days later, I was jogging on the sidewalk that snaked around Windsor Crossing. My typical route passed a small community pavilion near the center of the neighborhood, an area with benches, a decorative gazebo, and a neat row of parking spaces. That morning, I noticed a white van parked near the pavilion, with a bright green logo that read HOA Karen Transportation Services. A small group of neighbors, some elderly, some middle-aged, stood by the van, chatting amicably. I slowed my jog, curiosity piqued. Dialysis? Indeed, the van had the look of a medical transport service, complete with a wheelchair lift. My vantage point gave me a glimpse of the driver, helping an older gentleman into a seat. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a walker, waited patiently for her turn. I paused, checking my watch. Although I was off the clock from the National Kidney Foundation, my instincts sharpened whenever I saw anything related to kidney care. I decided to approach politely. "Good morning," I said, raising a hand in greeting. "Is this a neighborhood shuttle?" A man in his 70s, wearing a cap labeled Korean War Veteran, turned. "Oh, good morning. Actually, this is our local transport to a dialysis center. We have a group of us who need sessions 3 times a week, and HOA Karen picks us up so we don't have to drive." He offered a weary smile. I don't trust my reflexes anymore, so I rely on this service. My eyebrows rose. "That's wonderful. Is it sponsored by the HOA, or?" Another woman, short of breath, answered. "It used to be a private arrangement, but we got the HOA to help offset the cost by letting the van park here. Many of us rely on it. Frankly, we wouldn't know how to manage otherwise." I nodded, both impressed and relieved to see such an arrangement in place. Dialysis was life-sustaining for individuals with kidney failure, and missing treatments could have dire consequences. The idea that these patients had convenient transport was heartening. After exchanging a few pleasantries, I continued my jog, mind abuzz. I made a mental note to mention it at the upcoming HOA meeting, commending them for supporting such a critical service. Little did I know that this seemingly small detail, this specialized transport van, would become the center of a crisis that would rock Windsor Crossing. The Windsor Crossing Clubhouse was a spacious, modern facility, typically used for gatherings or small events. The night of the HOA meeting, its large multipurpose room was arranged with rows of chairs facing a long table, behind which Karen and the other board members sat like stern judges. About 40 residents filtered in, each carrying a mixture of caution and mild dread. I took a seat near the front to better see and hear the proceedings. At exactly 7 p.m., Karen tapped her gavel on the table. "Good evening, everyone," she began, voice crisp. "Let's call this meeting of the Windsor Preservation Council to order." She wasted no time diving into the agenda. Yard maintenance violations, updates on clubhouse maintenance, and new paint schemes for mailbox posts. The board members, an older man named Pete Dawson, a middle-aged woman named Ashley Caldwell, and a timid-looking individual named Ray Mills, mostly nodded along. I got the sense that Karen dominated the conversations, and they rubber-stamped her decisions. Eventually, Karen reached an agenda item labeled Community Partnerships. She sighed. "We've had repeated complaints about unauthorized vehicles in the community parking area at the pavilion," she said. "Specifically, a medical transport van. Some of you might be aware of this. It's been occupying multiple parking spaces and creating disruptions." A murmur rose from the crowd. Several of the elderly attendees looked upset. Karen continued, "I'm not opposed to helping seniors or anyone else in need of medical care, but the van's presence is not approved under our current parking regulations. It arrives at various hours, it's not purely residential, and it's using the pavilion area as though it's a bus station. This is not what Windsor Crossing is about. We have an image to uphold." I felt my pulse spike. My hand shot up, and Karen acknowledged me with a pointed look. "Yes, you there. New resident, correct?" I stood. "My name is Dr. Patrick Daniels. I moved here recently. May I ask what the specific complaints are about the HOA Karen van?" She pursed her lips. "Residents have said it blocks traffic, sometimes idles for too long, and it's an eyesore. This is a private, residential neighborhood, not a commercial zone." I forced myself to stay calm. "But that van is critical for those who need dialysis. Missing treatments or lacking reliable transportation can be life-threatening. Isn't there a way we can accommodate it? Karen gave me a tight-lipped smile. I understand your concern, doctor. However, the HOA must enforce its rules fairly. Allowing one special service sets a precedent. We can't have random vans in and out whenever they please. A wave of unease moved through the crowd. An older woman, voice trembling, stood. Karen, that van is the only way I can get to my dialysis appointments. Don't punish us. We have nowhere else to turn. Karen's demeanor stayed icy. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but the board will be reviewing how to handle this. Tonight is just an announcement. We'll finalize our decision soon. She swiftly moved to the next topic, ignoring any further objections. I sank back into my chair, anger smoldering in my chest. My mind whirred with alarm. Karen's fixation on neighborhood standards felt dangerously close to ignoring the real medical needs of vulnerable residents. I told myself that perhaps, if the community spoke up together, she'd see reason. But the looks on the faces of many indicated they were used to Karen's decisions. And rarely, if ever, did she back down. A few days after the meeting, I visited HOA Care Transportation Services at their local office. It was a modest building near the hospital district, a short drive from Windsor Crossing. Inside, the staff greeted me warmly. They recognized my name and affiliation with the National Kidney Foundation. After all, I often collaborated with transport services that helped patients reach dialysis centers on time. Sitting down with the office manager, I explained what was happening in my neighborhood. Our HOA is threatening to ban your van from our community's pavilion. That could disrupt your routine for multiple patients. She sighed, glancing at a list of scheduled pickups. We currently serve 5 residents in Windsor Crossing, some of our most consistent clients. They rely on the van every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We've never had issues there before, but lately, we've been hearing rumors that the HOA wants us gone. It's disheartening. I nodded. If your service is cut off, do you have a backup plan? She frowned. Not really. We can't afford to drive door to door if the HOA forbids us from parking at the pavilion. Some of these patients are too frail to meet us outside the neighborhood gates. We could be forced to discontinue service altogether. My concern deepened. For patients with kidney failure, dialysis is not optional. It's vital for survival. Missing even a single session can have serious health repercussions. I'm going to do everything I can, I promised. She thanked me, but the worry in her eyes lingered. I left, my mind swirling with possible approaches, legal, political, or communal. That afternoon, I attended an informal gathering at a neighbor's home. Residents swapped stories about HOA crackdowns, fines for minor infractions, threats of liens for late payments, and Karen's uncanny ability to sniff out anything that violated her version of community standards. When I brought up the dialyzed transport issue, the conversation turned somber. One man, who asked not to be named, whispered that Karen was rumored to have a personal dislike for outsiders and special provisions, seeing them as clutter or nuisance. My chest tightened with anger. If that rumor was true, her stance wasn't just about parking regulations. It was about punishing or excluding vulnerable community members. Something had to be done before patients lost a critical lifeline. Before going on the offensive, I decided to try a softer approach. Maybe, just maybe, Karen would be open to reason if it came from someone with authority in healthcare. So I requested a one-on-one meeting. To my surprise, she agreed, though she insisted we meet at the HOA office, an austere little room in the clubhouse basement, stacked with files of citations and guidelines. She arrived promptly, wearing a fitted blazer, hair neatly pinned, an air of business-like efficiency around her. I introduced myself again. Karen, I know we had a brief exchange at the HOA meeting, but let me clarify. I'm not just a concerned resident. I'm the director of the National Kidney Foundation. I've worked for years to ensure patients get access to dialysis. This is a matter of life and death. Her lips curved in a thin, polite smile. I appreciate your passion, Dr. Daniels. But you must also respect that I have a responsibility to the entire community. We can't let every medical service set up shop in our parking areas, can we? I spread my hands. We're talking about 5 individuals who need dialysis multiple times a week. The van doesn't linger. It loads and unloads patients. Could we not designate a short-term parking space near the pavilion for the van? Or at least accommodate them a few days a week? Karen's eyes narrowed. We've had complaints about the noise of the van's engine, the blocking of the pavilion drive, the unsightly presence of a commercial vehicle. Windsor Crossing is a premium residential neighborhood, not a medical facility. People pay good money to live here, expecting a peaceful environment. I took a calming breath, reminding myself not to lose my composure. Karen, dialysis patients are already burdened with a grueling treatment schedule. In many states, local HOAs find ways to accommodate medical transport. The cost of not doing so can be catastrophic for the patients and for the community's reputation. She stiffened, leaning back in her chair. Are you threatening legal action? It's not a threat. It's a reality, I said firmly. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it might be considered discriminatory if you actively prevent people with medical conditions from accessing necessary services. Karen's face flickered with annoyance. We're not discriminating. We're just enforcing our bylaws. If they want transport, they can arrange pickup outside the gates or at a designated commercial zone. My frustration boiled. Some can barely walk, let alone travel that far. You're effectively cutting them off. She stood, smoothing down her blazer. I see we're at an impasse. If you and your patients want to propose a new bylaw or arrangement, you can attend the next meeting. But as of now, the board sees no reason to bend the rules. Good day, doctor. With that, she walked out, leaving me alone with my anger echoing in the silent room. So much for the diplomatic approach. Realizing Karen wouldn't cooperate, I pivoted to building a broader coalition of neighbors who opposed her plan. I started by talking to each of the dialysis-dependent residents and their families, gathering personal stories about how the van's cancellation would harm them. Many were terrified. Some had no car. Others were too weak to drive. And a few had children or spouses who worked full-time and couldn't always provide rides. We formed a community health committee, a small group dedicated to preserving the dialysis transport. We used the neighborhood's online forum to share information, but we had to be discreet. Karen and her supporters patrolled the forum, deleting posts they deemed negative. So we also passed out flyers door to door, explaining the situation and why it mattered. The stories resonated with many. Some older neighbors told me privately that they might need dialysis themselves one day, or that they had relatives who did. Younger families worried about the principle. If the HOA could remove medical transport, what else might they do? Others still recalled how Karen had shut down simple services, like a volunteer-run kids' craft club in the clubhouse, just because it created noise. Momentum grew, but so did resistance. Karen launched a counter-campaign, claiming the dialysis van was unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone. She posted notices calling it a liability risk. The board members, at least Pete and Ashley, seemed to echo her talking points. Ray Mills, the timid one, stayed silent. One evening, I got a frantic call from Mrs. Hughes, the widow I'd met early on. Dr. Daniels, Karen's crew is putting up signs near the pavilion saying no commercial parking and trespassers will be towed. She's serious. My stomach dropped. The next pickup was the following morning. If the van arrived and found official-looking tow warnings, the driver might refuse to enter. Patients could miss their life or death treatments. I knew I had to act fast. I decided it was time to leverage the National Kidney Foundation's resources, media contacts, legal advisors, and public health advocates. Karen might be able to push around individual homeowners, but she'd find it harder to ignore a national medical organization shining a spotlight on her actions. The next day at dawn, I drove to the pavilion. Sure enough, new signs screamed, private parking, authorized vehicles only. All others will be towed at owner's expense. The old sign that read Dialycare Pickup Zone had been removed. Two of the dialysis patients were already there, leaning on walkers, looking distressed. The van approached slowly, the driver eyeing the signs nervously. I waved them forward, reassuring them. They're just threatening. You won't be towed today. I'll handle this. The driver parked, loaded the patients, and departed. As it left, I saw Karen standing across the street, arms folded, scowling. She said nothing but watched every move. That afternoon, I called a contact at the local newspaper, a journalist named Rachel Lynn who had covered healthcare stories before. I explained the gist, an HOA blocking medical transport for dialysis patients. Outraged, she agreed to investigate, especially since the National Kidney Foundation was involved. She came to Windsor Crossing 2 days later, interviewing patients, neighbors, and me. Karen refused to be interviewed. The story ran on the front page of the local section. Neighborhood HOA threatens to stop dialysis transport. Patients in peril. It spread quickly on social media, sparking heated debate. Some sided with Karen, claiming property rights and aesthetic concerns. But many more were horrified that vulnerable residents could be denied essential medical access. Local TV news picked it up. Within a week, I found myself doing an on-camera interview, standing by the pavilion, explaining, dialysis is not optional. Removing transport from those who can't drive is a direct threat to their health and well-being. We're urging the Windsor Crossing HOA to reconsider immediately. Karen was livid. She circulated a letter accusing me of unfairly maligning our community and using media sensationalism. She repeated her stance. Residents can drive themselves or arrange rides. The HOA is not obligated to host commercial vans. Meanwhile, the story reached a state-level kidney advocacy group, which blasted Karen's behavior as unconscionable. They threatened to file a complaint under federal anti-discrimination statutes. The pressure was mounting from multiple sides. Yet Karen refused to budge. Her arrogance seemed boundless, and she still had enough loyal supporters on the board to block any official reversal. We needed a knockout blow, something that would make it impossible for her to continue her cold-hearted campaign. Tensions ran high in Windsor Crossing. No commercial parking signs remained. Jellycare's driver had grown nervous, half expecting a tow truck to materialize. The patient's stress soared. Some considered skipping treatments out of fear of confrontation. Then came the terrifying night that changed everything. Around 2 a.m., I received a frantic phone call from a neighbor. Mrs. Hughes, the widow who had a heart condition and failing kidneys, was in dire shape. She'd been retaining fluid, feeling dizzy, and suffering from shortness of breath. She needed emergency dialysis. I rushed to her house. She was slumped in a living room chair, eyes half open, breathing shallowly. Her ankles were swollen. Her entire body was weak. Her adult daughter, who lived an hour away, hadn't arrived yet. A glance told me she needed medical attention immediately. I called an ambulance, but she insisted. They always take so long to get here from the next town. The dialysis center is locked up at this hour, anyway. I can't. She trailed off, nearly fainting. I did what I could to keep her stable, checking vitals, elevating her feet. A neighbor had called the paramedics. But in that moment, all I could think was how precarious her condition was. If the Jellycare service had been fully supported, maybe they had an emergency contact or special arrangement. But the HOA's hostility had stifled any possibility of after-hours help. When the ambulance finally arrived, it took them 20 minutes to stabilize her. By the time they whisked her away, her eyes had rolled back, face ashen. We learned later she'd gone into acute pulmonary edema, her lungs filling with fluid. For a kidney patient, missing a treatment or being delayed in getting emergent care can cause fluid overload, which is exactly what happened. Mrs. Hughes survived, but only narrowly. The hospital kept her in ICU for 2 days. The entire neighborhood whispered about the incident. Residents started connecting the dots. If the HOA had embraced medical transport instead of ostracizing it, maybe Mrs. Hughes could have received more frequent checkups or immediate backup from Jellycare. At that point, even some of Karen's allies began questioning her stance. She'd nearly let an elderly woman die by discouraging a vital service. Sensing a shift, our community health committee demanded an emergency HOA meeting to revisit the dialysis transport ban. Karen, cornered, had to oblige. But she wasn't going down without a fight. A week later, the Windsor Crossing clubhouse brimmed with tension. Nearly every seat was filled. People stood along the walls. In the front row sat the dialysis patients, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes, looking both scared and resolute. The local press had shown up, along with an attorney from a disability rights group. Karen sat behind the long table, flanked by the other board members. Her expression was grim as she banged her gavel. "Let's call this meeting to order," she intoned. I was the first to stand. "Karen, you've spent months blocking Jellycare from our neighborhood. We have multiple residents in dire need of that service. Some nearly died because of your policy. We're asking, no, demanding, that the board reverse this ban." A ripple of applause coursed through the room. Karen's eyes flashed. "Dr. Daniels, with all due respect, the board has a responsibility to uphold neighborhood standards. We can't have large commercial vehicles coming and going. Liability and aesthetic concerns. Excuse me, interjected Charles Warner, an attorney from a disability rights organization. Your stance raises serious legal red flags under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. By impeding critical medical transport, you could be found in violation of federal law. Karen tried to keep her composure. We are not refusing medical care. These individuals can find other transport methods. Charles pressed on, voice clear. But you are knowingly creating barriers for disabled residents, effectively discriminating against them. We have the documents to prove it, including internal memos from the HOA discussing ways to remove so-called medical vans from the premises. A shocked murmur spread among the crowd. Karen glared at him. We had to consider all aspects: noise, risk, property values. At that point, one of the dialysis patients, a man named Alfred, struggled to stand, leaning heavily on his cane. Ms. Arvindale, he said, voice trembling. I don't have family who can drive me to dialysis. If you ban the van, I literally cannot get to my treatments. Do you realize how terrifying that is? Karen stared at him, her eyes cold. I'm sorry, but I must be fair to all residents. We have many who object to the van. Where are they? Asked a voice from the back. Most of us support the van. Indeed, a majority of neighbors in the room shouted agreement. Sensing the tide turning, Karen hammered her gavel in frustration. Order. We'll take a formal vote by show of hands. The crowd quieted. She called for a motion to either continue the dialysis transport or forbid it. Hands shot up overwhelmingly in favor of allowing the service. Even two of the board members, Pete and Ray, timidly raised their hands. Only Ashley Caldwell kept hers down, siding with Karen. Karen's face went pale. The motion to allow Jellycare had passed by a huge margin. People cheered, and some patients wept with relief. But Karen wasn't done. She sneered. We have other means of enforcement. The board can impose fines, maintain stricter rules. She was interrupted by a stern voice. The disability rights attorney said, You'd be opening yourself to personal liability if you defy the expressed will of the community and the law. We'll file an immediate injunction if you do. Karen looked as if she'd swallowed a lemon. Without another word, she gathered her papers and stormed out. But behind her, the crowd erupted in celebration. People shook my hand, hugging each other, relieved that sense and compassion had prevailed. Yet I had a nagging feeling. Karen might have lost this round, but she could still cause trouble. And I was right. She was about to escalate matters in a far more dangerous manner. In the days following the explosive HOA meeting, the board's official minutes reflected the community vote. Jellycare was allowed to continue picking up residents at the pavilion. That should have resolved the issue. But then came a bizarre twist. Late one evening, a mechanic's truck appeared by the pavilion. Under cover of darkness, workers removed the speed bumps near the parking area and installed metal gates at either end of the street leading to the pavilion. The next morning, neighbors woke to find a sign, Private Road, Access Restricted. Rumors spread that Karen, still seething, had authorized an infrastructure change to enhance neighborhood security. But it effectively blocked the van from entering the pavilion area without a special key or code. Residents fumed. The brand new gates had no known passcode, and no official notice had gone out. For a couple of days, the dialysis van had to pick up patients at the gates, forcing them to walk or wheel themselves from the pavilion to the entrance. Some almost fainted in the summer heat. This was the final straw. I contacted the city council, the local disability rights attorney, and the press, presenting evidence that Karen had acted unilaterally, without a board vote, to install these gates. The city planning department quickly deemed the gates unapproved. Since the road was partially city-owned, or at least designated for public use under certain easements, Karen had no legal right to block it. Within a week, a city inspector arrived with an order to remove the gates. When Karen tried to protest, the inspector threatened hefty fines and even criminal charges for tampering with public easements. That same day, an attorney representing the National Kidney Foundation filed a formal complaint against Karen personally, citing her deliberate acts to impede medical care for vulnerable individuals. The complaint alleged that her repeated attempts to block dialysis transport constituted willful endangerment. Meanwhile, the local news had a field day. Camera crews captured footage of frustrated patients, blocked gates, and city workers forcibly dismantling Karen's barriers. Even some of her old supporters distanced themselves, appalled by her cruelty and worried they'd be named co-defendants in any lawsuit. Sensing a full-blown scandal, the rest of the HOA board convened an emergency session without Karen. They unanimously voted to strip her of the presidency. They also pledged full compliance with the city order, removing the gates and restoring the speed bumps for safety. But Karen's downfall was only beginning. The legal machine rumbled into motion. On top of losing her HOA presidency, Karen found herself named in multiple actions. A civil suit from the National Kidney Foundation, backed by the disability rights group, for obstructing medical services. A complaint to state authorities claiming she violated the Fair Housing Act and disability accommodation laws. A city code enforcement action for installing gates without proper permits. Worse, the local media discovered questionable financial dealings. Karen had allegedly directed HOA funds toward the gate installation without a formal vote. There were rumors that her personal business had also profited from shady home improvement contracts in Windsor Crossing. Facing mounting pressure, the new HOA leadership cooperated with investigators. They provided emails and documents showing Karen's reckless disregard for medical necessity. They found quotes from Karen calling the dialysis patients a nuisance in private messages. This hardened the case against her. In a tense hearing at the county courthouse, the judge granted an injunction forcing Karen to cease any interference with Jellycare or other healthcare transports. The judge's scathing remarks from the bench condemned her callous disregard for neighbors' well-being. The city's code enforcement board fined her heavily for unauthorized construction. And that was just the start of her financial woes. Civil proceedings dragged on for months. Eventually, Karen was found liable for damages to the dialysis patients who had suffered stress, mistreatments, or faced life-threatening complications. The settlement was enormous. Karen, unable to pay, watched as a lien was placed on her property. Ultimately, the court ordered the confiscation of her home to cover part of the settlement. Additionally, she faced criminal charges of endangerment, leading to a short but symbolic prison sentence. Her downfall was as public as it was dramatic. Gone was the pastel-bloused matriarch of Windsor Crossing, replaced by a disgraced figure who had let petty personal biases overshadow fundamental human decency. With Karen out of the picture, Windsor Crossing breathed a collective sigh of relief. The new HOA board reorganized under a president named Margaret Blake, a compassionate woman who prioritized transparency. They updated the bylaws to explicitly allow medical transport and services. Jellycare resumed regular pickups without obstruction. The entire community seemed lighter, freer. And as for Mrs. Hughes, she continued her dialysis sessions, her health more stable than ever. She joked that she'd outlive all of us, just to spite Karen, who had once made her life so difficult. The press eventually moved on to other stories, but the moral of this one lingered. Sometimes, a seemingly minor issue, in this case, a simple van that transported fragile patients, can reveal the heart of a community's character. Standing together for what's right, we overcame an overbearing, arrogant figure who thought her rules were more important than people's lives. As the director of the National Kidney Foundation, I returned to my usual advocacy work, albeit with a new story to share: how a small suburban neighborhood nearly lost access to life-saving treatments due to one person's hubris, and how, in the end, empathy and collective action triumphed. Windsor Crossing, once overshadowed by a tyrannical HOA president, evolved into a model for compassion and inclusivity. Karen, on the other hand, lost her position, her property, and her freedom, all because she chose to put her rigid vision of order above basic humanity.